Pulsex tokenomics. I love them. Somebody wants to talk about them, I'm here. So the liquidity pool got so insanely large for Pulsex for a swap, not the liquidity it held, but just the liquidity for its token. Got like over $1 billion for both sides of the pair, over 600 million per side of the pair for the liquidity, which was just outrageous. I find it interesting. There's still a debate. Like, yeah, Pulse will get burnt, but it won't get bought in that process. It'll just disappear from the system, getting more and more scarce, which sure will up its demand over time. But Pulsex doing the buy and burn, it's an awesome mechanic, and I really hadn't taken into account the adoption rate of the internet versus crypto. Like, there are people out there saying the adoption rate is 115% a year, which means 215% of the year before, like a little more than a 2x of people that are adopting crypto. And at that rate, you ever do the penny a day thing with your teacher, like, hoorah, in 10 years everybody on the planet should be using crypto. Like, that's one heck of an adoption rate, but the buy and burn should be quite powerful. I'm quite satisfied with the power of this thing now that I've actually taken some ideas to adoption to it. Yeah, I'm getting more excited hearing, Richard Hart talk about, okay, yeah, he's not wasting too much time on superfluous programming, and he's getting closer on Pulsechain, and it makes sense that, hey, the Ethereum merger is about to happen. So awesome. We get to get all sorts of new data from the Ethereum merger, get to see what, a proof of work versus a proof of stake split looks like, even though the one chain is going to be abandoned theoretically. But we get to see a whole lot of stuff to refine what's going on, and I don't care if it doesn't launch till 2023, but it does feel like it's getting closer again. The energy is starting to build around the idea of its launch. And not a lot of people realize that, where Ethereum has been inflationary and deflationary, like Pulsechain is just going to be deflationary. So it really is going to get more scarce over time and probably go up with price very quickly. Burn rate is even faster than people realize because the IEEE something protocol, there's basically a redundancy to the burn, which depending on the use.
It's EIP 1559, that fee burn mechanic.
Thank you. So yeah, that allows for basically a double burn into the system, which I believe depending on the state of the system, can really max that out. Interesting projections months ago where it could burn over 9% of the transaction fees with that double kick in it, depending on the situation. So yeah, Pulsechain
So
will burn.
I was gonna say, let me see if Money Talk has a question, and then if not, I want to hit a couple of like big points there, because there's a lot of stuff that we've all discussed, but I want to like hit on some of those, like where the people really understand how impactful some of that stuff you hit on is.
I was at PulseCon this week, which was a blast. Of course, the liquidity will be way different on mainnet than PulseNet on testnet, and I was one of the pieces that I haven't been able to nail down or feel like I have nailed down with Pulsechain. When the AMM bot goes and harvests the liquidity from the different decentralized exchanges and whatnot, do you guys have any insights or thoughts on that extra liquidity, what it'll go towards or how it'll be used, just with the excess liquidity? And I'd love your guys' insights.
Sure. What are you specifying as the leftover or that remainder?
So if I'm not mistaken, right, you got the sacrificers who will get Pulsechain, but and then on top of that, in order to balance out the pools and the different, you got the pools and the different decentralized exchanges and whatnot, all the ETH in the system now becomes Pulsechain, and that gets harvested by the AMM bot. So that would be supply that came not from sacrificers, if I'm thinking about it correctly, an extra that just needed to be harvested and deployed however the AMM bot was designed, correct?
Okay. Yes, this is really tricky for order of operations, but it makes more sense if you kind of go through step by step, and we don't use the sort of word that are like harvest means a lot of things all in one thing, but step by step, it really makes sense. So everyone knows they're going to get their copy of their coins, right? Biggest airdrop. Like, that's the big mechanic. Okay. So that doesn't come from the fork. Like, there's other forks where that doesn't happen, right? Like BSC is a fork. There's a lot of ETH forks where you didn't get this copy, right? So there's the actual fork of the network, and then there's this giant airdrop that comes from a system state copy. So all the transactions, all these interactions, essentially this history of ETH just gets mirrored on top of Pulsechain. And that's where all these free coins come from, all these copies, all this cool stuff going on. So that also copies the liquidity pools as well. So all those liquidity pools that everyone's purchasing and swapping out of dexes, those get copied as well. And just the same way that you get, if you have 10,003 hex, you're going to get 10,003 p hex. That liquidity pool is mirrored in that same way. So as Money Talk was saying, now there's a giant difference in supply between Pulse and ETH. So since that supply is different, that pricing is wrong now, where there should actually be 1.2 million Pulse because there's a much, much larger supply, but there's just one. So this AMM bot, which again, it's hard for us to think about what that is. It is almost no different than any individual person. All it is the bot is a big script, but all it's doing is buying. So rather than us thinking about harvesting and an AMM bot, all it is let's just imagine, we won't use RH because that kind of adds expectation. So to get all these prices correct, luckily we have Top Gun and he's good at math. He's going to go through and literally mint Pulse on the side. So he's going to start with this bag of Pulse, and then he's going to buy every single PRC and back until that price is correct. So he's going to go through because he's got the big bag, he's minting the Pulse, and that's what that harvesting, that's what that AMM bot is, right? So there's one Pulse to however many of these PRCs, and that pricing is way wrong. It's giving Pulse this astronomically high price. So Top Gun's going to go through and buy it until that ratio is correct, and that price reflects what it would reflect on ETH essentially as far as each other, right? Not in US dollars, but in their price to each other, right? So it doesn't give a price as in a dollar value, but you can price things in other things, right? So it's correcting the price as in the price in Pulse, so that ratio is maintained. Now, what Money Talks is asking is, well, what about all that stuff it buys? So that's where all this liquidity is going to come into Pulsex. So if you imagine that you have all this Pulse that you mint, and you go through and you're buying all the tokens up so that you get that price corrected. So now when all the pools, where like in Uniswap 2 and in Curve and Aave and all these pools, they're all going to get price corrected because they're going to get bought out. So now they're going to have Pulse in very little of all the what are now PRC20s. So this AMM bot, which is just Top Gun, he went through and bought all these pools up so that those prices are corrected. And now he's got a big bag of all these PRCs. Now he is going to provide liquidity in Pulsex and add the Pulse so that those pools are correct. So now, thanks Top Gun and all his math, which is the AMM bot, they bought the pools until they were correct in all these other liquidity pools. And then now they're taking all that liquidity they bought, all these PRCs, and they're providing that ratio corrected in Pulsex as well. And so that means that by the time the network is turned on and made public and all of us come in, now all these prices are not necessarily correct and that's how the market's going to value them, but they're correct in that now they're a true copy of what the ratio should be from ETH. And now we have Pulsex, which is now filled with all this liquidity because that AMM bot went and bought all those pools up and then moved it over into Pulsex. So now all of us have corrected pools. There's liquidity to trade all these things across. Pulse is everywhere as far as in these pairs, which makes some routing and other things technically easy to make sure the transactions go smooth and there's not slippage and all these issues you can see. And literally right off the bat, it's like we just kicked off the start of this with this super liquid DEX. There's all the pairs and everything's up and running from the beginning. And that's what this AMM bot is doing. So there's a lot of motion there and like words we use to try to make that shorter, but all it is purchasing up to correct the pools that are there, taking what you purchased and then adding them in Pulsex at that same ratio.
So equally, I do understand the concern that if we launch the most liquid DEX ever with everything all at once, it might be kind of difficult to move that price at first. So it'll be interesting to see what the OA decides to do with that deployment. How much of the liquidity will be in Pulsex on that beginning.
Richard had talked about when he streamed into the conference yesterday, he said the team was working on consensus. Could you guys talk about what exactly that means? Is that like with the validator rotation and transactions being confirmed, or what did he mean by that?
Consensus is what he's referring to is all the validators being on the same page and agreeing. Consensus means agreement, right? So what he's getting into is there's different ways to attack. So this gets really technical, really, really fast here. And that's why he usually just kind of like puts it out there and then sort of moves on. So proof of stake is what we usually call Pulsechain. What it actually is distributed proof of stake with authority, which is just an absolute rabbit hole of math for anyone who wants to go down it. So again, it gets very technical very quick, but what he's referring to is making sure that using Pirelli and Parla, which are like these very base levels of the code that allows all these nodes to speak to each other and agree. What it comes down to is what he's really saying is that all these validators have to have a rotation that is part of that code. They have to have a way of saying, hey, this is the correct transactions. This node is telling me the truth. And so consensus is that level of the code where all these validators are having communication back and forth, and that they're able to, one, decide whose block is this for which validator, because they rotate. Did this validator do this correctly? And when that information is passed on, like, okay, is this the longest? Is this the true chain? So consensus is again, it gets really spun very quick, but that's what it is. It's that code where all these validators are discussing and making sure these things are correct. And there's different ways that you can attack this. So things like a double spend, that's usually something people will hear. That can happen at this layer of consensus, where you can try to get in there and do double spends and try to get the validators to disagree and allow you to spend a coin twice. You can try to break that consensus as a way of attacking the network. And then you can also try to overwhelm certain parts of that code and deny service or pause the chain. That's what he was getting at there. So it would be the same as if, everyone here is discussing things and we're all in agreement. You can basically send transactions that are just a lot of noise at the validators and cause them to lose that consensus. And then that's when these things pause and you're not able to make transactions anymore. So this is something like you see on Solana, not to just call them up and roast, but that's denial of service, where these things get overwhelmed and they get paused. There's different aspects of this that cause node operation on BSC to be very expensive. If you look at what it costs to run some of these nodes that have information, getting those to maintain consensus, because that code is not as polished as you would like, it becomes more expensive. And when it comes to node operations and some of these things, it's like transactions, where if a transaction is, say, $3 versus $30, right? Most of us don't make all that many transactions, right? So if you're in Hex or Pulse or PulseX or Colt or Uniswap or any of these cool things, majority of it you're just buying and holding. Then if a transaction is $3 or $30, you just think, okay, well, I lost $27 of profit, right? I would rather have that $27. But when you look at it on a network scale, or you look at something that has to make a lot of transactions, that order of magnitude difference in price, it breaks models. It changes behavior very, very quickly, right? So say if you're a large player, then what do I care about $27, right? But if I'm an onboarder who's trying to DCA in every Friday and I can put in $100, that's 30% of my buy-in. If I can put in $200, it's 15% of my buy-in. And you can break things quickly with how those things cost. And that happens at the node level, where the more there's cost in the node, the less people are willing to run them, the more centralized they become, the more people don't do things that they would do if they could do them more inexpensively. So you have to start making compromises on security, or compromises on gas efficiency, or compromises in how many transactions you make. So things we don't notice as far as cost on certain things, when you're looking at them at a network scale or certain types of protocols, that difference in what it costs to run a node or what these transactions cost make a much bigger deal. So having that consensus model very tight, where it can't be attacked, where it's not being paused, where doing all these things is very efficient, it means much more to the system than we would kind of innately feel as a user.
Cool. That was great. Thank you.
Basically, in a census network, there are 3 simple ways to prevent a lot of these attacks, which is just, I believe, some sort of block consensus at a specific height. And then because that can be attacked, a randomized one as well. And then just because if validators end up in and out of the loop, if you add a timestamp to the blockchain, then it helps kind of those 3 little simple additions just should solve a lot of those problems.
Cool.